Let's continue our study of layer styles by doing something relatively simple. Go into your working folder and open up a document named dropshadow.psd. Now inside there I have a background so we can kind of see the drop shadow. That makes sense. And I have the word drop shadow or words drop shadow in a layer. Now I did one other thing after I made that layer. I rasterized the text. In other words, I went to the type tool, typed in drop shadow, made sure it was spelled correctly, and I liked the font. And then I went up to the word layer and went down to rasterize. Now it's grayed out now because I've already done it. The reason I did that is so you would have exactly what I have. It's not going to impact what we're going to do. But if I did this and left it as a font and you didn't have the font, it would substitute for another font. And that's, I suppose, not the end of the world. But that's why I did that. Now let's go into layers. Let me move it up here so we can see it better. Yeah, just like that. Give it a little bit more room down here. Select the layer that you want to apply the effect to, and that's drop shadow. Go into the FX button right here, and right at the bottom of all of them is drop shadow. Now, when you first apply a drop shadow, it goes into what's defined, I suppose, as default settings. Once you're here, if you want to, you can apply other things to it. It doesn't have to be just a drop shadow, which is kind of nice. You have a preview button over here, which allows you to kind of turn it on and off, see what it looks like before and after. And then you have all these options here. Let's start at the top and work our way down. The cool thing is, a lot of the options that you see here will be repeated as options in a lot of the other styles. So learning them here helps you as you go along. Number one, you have a blending mode for the shadow. Now remember, that's the shadow, not the word drop shadow. The shadow blending mode by default is multiply, which is a good one. You can change that if you want to, play around. It helps to blend the shadow into the background to make it look a little bit more natural. Now the default color is black. If you don't want black, come right up here, click that button, change it to another color. Now don't forget, when you're using a blending mode, changing the color from black will blend the color, especially if you're using multiply, into the other color. So if you want red, you may not get red if you're using multiply. You have to play around. Opacity, well, it's the opacity of the shadow. I can make it more intense, like I've got a very harsh light shining on it, or I can make it more soft, assuming I've got a softer light. The default, I'm going to type that in because I have such a bad time with sliders. I'm going to type in 75. That's the default. Now the angle is 125 degrees, which means the sunlight is coming from the upper left. According to studies, that is the best, most comfortable angle as a reader or looking at your designs that you can use for me, unless, of course, the design needs a different angle. Western culture goes left to right. Okay, so that's part of it. The other part is when we see a shadow, we normally think of the light source being high, not low. So it's down and to the right, because in Western culture, we're up and to the left. So the shadow is coming down because the sun is up here and going down this way. What I try to do when I make a design, especially when I'm doing something in marketing, is doing things to attract your attention, but not to distract you. And this is considered a comfortable angle. You want to change it, you go right here and either do it here or move it around. Let's take that back to 125. Global light. This is not the only style that uses lighting systems. You've got bevels, embosses, lots of different things. If you leave this on, and in most cases I would recommend that, when you add another effect, it uses the same angle, which in the case of trying to make it look natural is something you need to do. Distance, how far is the drop shadow away from the word drop shadow? Now to me, when you do this to a certain point, it makes the word drop shadow look like it's rising off the surface. Spread increases the intensity or the density of the shadow. And size allows me to soften it up. So if I'm going further away, the shadow would be more indistinct. And so in this case, I can make it look a little bit more natural. You have a curve for the shadow. Now, we actually haven't gotten into curves yet, but they work the same way here as they do when we get into things like color correction with curves. But they change the brightness levels of the pixels. And you do have some presets. Some of these are kind of wonky. They make it look less real and more surreal. But that's up to you. Different ways you can look at it. This is normal. We'll take it back to normal. You have an anti-aliasing option. which just helps the shadow look a little bit softer against the background. Works better if you're using a different contour. We'll leave that off. Noise, if you want to make it noisy, you can. Now let's stop there for a minute before we get into the other options and click OK. Now there it is, FX. There's our drop shadow. And there it is right here. In the lesson on blending modes, I talked about something, and that was the difference between an opacity and a fill. And if you followed along with the lessons one after another, you've already got to that lesson. But opacity changes the entire thing. The whole kit and caboodle, everything goes away. Fill only works with the paint. It doesn't touch the layer style. That's why fill only works if you got a layer style. And if I take that down, as you can see, wind up with that if you want to. The paint's gone, the shadow's still there. To me, that kind of reminds me of spray painting like letters, like a stencil onto something, and then you remove the stencil, and you have these areas that the stencil was on, and then the paint's over here. Just kind of that way to me. I'm going to turn that back on again. Now let's go back into drop shadow by double-clicking here. Our next option down is layer knocks out drop shadow. Let me turn that off, click OK, and come back out again. Now watch what happens when I turn fill down now. The layer doesn't knock out the drop shadow. You have the words drop shadow as a shadow and noisy. Let's go ahead and turn that back up. Let's go back in one more time. Down here, you have, let me turn that back on, make default. Andy, I'm doing a whole bunch of drop shadows. And every time I come back here, they go back to the default. And for a while, I would like it to be this for consistency. Well, make it default. Or I'm done with it, reset to default. Now, if you do that now, basically it will take it back to the way it was. But if you make it a default, that's a way to get it back to the actual Photoshop defaults. Now, let me show you one more thing for control. If I'm looking to do my drop shadow, but I'm not really sure exactly what I want for distance and things like that, or angle, I can actually come out here. And if I click and hold my mouse, I can actually move it this way too. Just one more way to gain the control that you need to get exactly what you want in a non-destructive way. You like what you got? Click OK. You don't want it anymore? Throw it in the trash can. You want to change it? Double click on it and go right back here. Non-destructive editing, drop shadows.